Welcome to the Meru Media Podcast with Mukunda.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Meru Media Podcast. I'm joined today by a very special guest, Dr. Chakravarthi Ram-Prasad from Lancaster University. He is, I recently just got onto him about a year ago, and I'm following a lot of his lectures and his work online. I'll put the links in below. And he really fascinated me. I think what really caught my attention to you first was your lecture on the nature of God and the Ramanuja concept. I think you did this with a Search for Truth or something, that podcast. Yes. And I really, it was one of the best, I think, articulations of the concepts. I think the Sri Vaishnava, or particular Ramanuja Visisthadvaita view of God was, and it was, and I just was really pulled to it. And from that, I read all your work and everything I could get my hands on. So Dr. Prasad, thank you so much for joining us today. Namaste, namaskaram. And I know you're a very busy a man. So, thank you again. Can you tell us a little bit about background? Like what is it? Where are you from? What drew you to this? What was your journey of sorts?
Right. Yes, I think every time we say that, some of the aspect of our story comes to the fore, right, to ourselves. So yeah, I was born to begin at the beginning, as it were, into a Sri Vaishnava family, and as you were saying, Mukunda, in fact, same as you, from a Swamacharya background, and in Chennai, what was Madras, and I went to school there, and then I moved to Bangalore for my degree because my parents by then had met Satya Sai Baba, and my father sort of dedicated his work, left the civil service from a high-ranking position to work at the university, and then the various sort of charitable undertakings there. So I studied at the Whitefield campus of what's now the Satya Sai Institute, and then did my master's in Pushback for a program that was relatively short-lived at the time, called the MA in History and Culture. And one of the things that we face in India as a whole is that although we feel in America or in Britain that the humanities are embattled, the study of sort of ancient and classical cultures and sources are constantly under threat from commercial forces, that research funding bodies put all the money into the sciences and so forth. In India, we have a more insidious problem, that there is a certain kind of way in which the modern university structure has simply not coped or come up with an efficient way in post-colonial India to preserve and yet modernize the diversity of our cultural and intellectual traditions. So either it becomes an exercise in sort of competing, sort of reservation things about, oh, well, if you're going to have a center for Vaishnava studies, you must have a center for Shaiva studies. So that kind of fragmentation happens in an institutional way. There is also, of course, the competition between, well, where do you study Vaishnavism as opposed to, say, Sufi Islam? Where do you study a particular branch of Mahayana Buddhism as opposed to Sikhism? It all then gets pulled back into people's religious, political, or what we call communal identities. So for a variety of reasons, for a country with such a staggering array of cultural, intellectual pluralism, the modern university has not been able to cope with it. A consequence of that is that within the larger collapse of the humanities, areas like literature and history, so too with philosophy, so too with the study of religion, these have all become polarized, narrow, often badly taught and badly studied, and with very low value as education and as economic opportunity, as pedagogical status, even as, paradoxically, the supposed relevance of ancestral culture and religious values are supposed to be more important than at any time. So, but what I found in the brief period, the Satsang Institute was able to have run a master's program in history and Indian culture, which was led by one of the doyens of late 20th century Sanskrit, mid 20th century Sanskrit scholarship, a man called Krishnamurti, who had been in Mysore for a lot of his time. He was somebody who was as adept at Nyaya as he was in Alankara. So he could teach logic, he could teach aesthetics, he could do history. And he really inspired me. And I had a completely lunatic idea of doing my dissertation on what rather simplistically I thought would be building a kind of metaphysics, a metaphysical explanation for contemporary physics, especially quantum mechanics, which didn't use the same kind of Western philosophical categories with which philosophy of science is done, but do it with Advaita Vedanta and Madhyamika Buddhism. And although I was hopelessly underqualified for it, I kind of essayed forth a kind of rough outline of how to read a metaphysics into non-classical physics. That kind of diverted me from where I had thought all my life I was going to go, which was join the Indian Foreign Service, and I was preparing for that, and I took the exams, and I was on the verge of, I think, going to the interviews and so forth, when the late Krishnamurti said, this is a very interesting work. And he said, for the first time I heard this name, and he said, I know Bimal Matilal. Do you know Bimal Matilal? And I said, no. And he said, he was Radhakrishna's successor. We passed between the person who was appointed in between. He's a Spalding professor at All Souls. And that kind of like set off a bulb in my head. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go and study more of this stuff with Matilal. And without turning a hair, my parents were like, okay, so, you are going to go into the Indian diplomatic service. You're going to be, I don't know, ambassador in Brazil, instead of which you're, going to be an impoverished lecturer in some part of the world that will give you a job. So they supported me. Matilal, meanwhile, had been battling it out in Oxford, in the internal politics of Oxford, where he was saying that, look, the category of philosophy should be pluralized. You can't keep on studying in what was, until last year, Oxford's Oriental Institute.
Right.
It should be, you can't sort of say, oh, it's in theology or whatever. This should be studied when you're talking about metaphysics, you're talking about epistemology. These are Western categories, but the content, the thought, the ideas are available. The challenges about the nature of self-awareness, the nature problem of the external world, how do we know through perception? All these kind of questions are very much part of the Indian traditions and have been for a very long time.
Right.
He had a very important point at the time, ally of two major famous analytic philosophers at Oxford, Michael Dummett and Peter Strawson. And Michael Dummett was a chair of the faculty. So I became a guinea pig. I was allowed in, the first person to actually undertake a DPhil, an Oxford doctorate, in primarily on Indian philosophy.
Wow.
So that was what came in. And I had no training in philosophy. My undergraduate degree had been in politics, history, sociology. My MA was history, but with a little bit of Indian culture, and through Indian culture into Indian philosophical thinking. So it was a hard slog to try and get my way at top speed, very steep learning curve, get myself familiarized with Oxford analytic philosophy, which was at its heyday in the 1980s, taking especially on metaphysics, much less. I wasn't interested that much in philosophy of language, which was also a dominant strain at Oxford at that time. So it was in that way. Then it took me a few years to figure out exactly what was sustainable. But from the beginning, I felt that the important point was to think about the problem rather than the particular cultural resource which alone could exclusively legislate on what was a philosophical problem. So in that sense, I kind of stumble into the necessity for the comparative method, which is that when you're challenging something, by opening up the sources from which you can understand the question, you might have mutually illuminating answers that studying one kind of tradition within one particular text or language might not necessarily deliver. So I wrote my dissertation on the problem of the external world. What is it to say that the world exists, and developed a view that I call non-realism, which was kind of partaking of some of what's known as anti-realism, internal realism, and so on in Western metaphysics, but saying that particular problems that had arisen since Kant and Berkeley about how to talk about the status of the external world could be creatively addressed through three major Advaita thinkers, just Sriharsha, first of all Shankara, then Vachaspati Mishra, and Sriharsha. So in a way, of course, I was also sort of trying to say that the comparative method is not about making non-Western materials the kind of handmaidens of Western philosophical thought, but rather to say, look, history has happened. We are where we are. The previous 3 centuries had taken Western self-conceptions of intellectual disciplines through colonialism to around the world. So when people talk about the category of philosophy, the problems that are articulated today in financially dominant, politically pervasive institutions, they're going to come from Western philosophy. So to that extent, we can't pretend that doesn't happen. I can't go back and pretend that, I'm sitting in Srirangam in the 13th century listening to Vedanta Deshika. It's not going to happen. So what are we going to do? To say, okay, we start from here, but we decenter how the program actually runs. So yes, this is a problem, but you know what? By the middle of the first millennium, these thinkers in their Sanskrit texts were talking about these issues, and you don't need to take my word for it. Let's have translations of these materials and say, can we build on them? Can we have creative responses which are seen as transcending history to address contemporary notions when it comes to Greek thought? You're allowed to do that with Aristotle, whereas you're not allowed somehow to do the Sanskrit thinkers without saying, well, this was a context in which they operated, this was the courtly patronage they had, this is likely to have been the place they worked, and shut them away in history. No, let them live to what they say to us today. So that's how my sort of program, as it were, began. Oddly enough, with Advaita rather than with Visisthadvaita, to which I did not turn until maybe 12, 13 years ago with my, I think, 5th or 6th book.
So interesting enough, I mean, a couple questions here. Did you grow up with the Visisthadvaita tradition, or was your family a little more secularized in terms of how
yeah, that's an interesting thing, because I think that actually we could use this kind of cultural background, and I'm sure you're familiar with this too, to actually put some pressure on the concept of the secular, not only the Western concept, but even the Indian concept of the secular. Because here you have people who are located, living in the tradition. So day to day, whether it's the altar or it's the language that you learn, the hymns, the pasarams of the arvas that are chanted, for me, dusk was always associated with the thickening of the light and the smell of the jasmine, and to hear the refrain of Empavai as my mother, sang Andal's Tirupavai. That was just there. And yet my mother had done her degrees in economics. And she and my father had wooed each other over quoting the lake poets. So it wasn't as if there was that tension. So what is it to be religious? What is it to be secular? These things are seen as particular political constructs when it comes to the reality of this life. So to the extent it was taken for granted, well, you're born into this background, you grew up in it, you have certain advantages that came out of it. You also have to face the iniquities of the historical, prejudices that have accompanied it. So there is that internal dialectic between how to be in the tradition, but also how to respond to it. And in fact, some years ago, I gave a talk at Harvard, which the title of which was "How to Talk for and Against Oneself."
Yes, I saw that. It was a great lecture. I loved it.
Thank you very much. So that was sort of implicitly in the, what are the things you do? My father, as a senior civil servant, was aware that, if he's a collector in a large district, then it's about ensuring that whatever resources the Indian state had was implemented as equitably as possible across that population. So you had to, including following requirements of reservations and so forth, because you had to both accepting who you are is both sort of being able to occupy the faith and the living tradition while also asking critical questions of it. And asking those questions is, as I said, earlier, history has happened. We are, in a modern nation state with a liberal pluralist. Sorry, I think we froze for a bit. We're constantly percolating where we are in this multidimensional world, where different things become salient at different points. So yeah, that's a complicated answer to that question, but it's kind of putting pressure in a way on the very categories which arise from a very specific Western experience, which makes much less sense in India.
It's interesting because it's like, I think when we do talk about the secular, non-secular divide, it's not as pervasive as people would make it out to be and even in the American context, right? Like growing up here in Orange County, I belong to this Hindu community, but I didn't know too many Hindu people. All my schools, I was the only Hindu kid. And because my father was more religious, I would every day have to wear namam, right? So every morning I do puja and I'd go to school and I remember sitting outside trying to rub it off because it was people would make fun of me. After a while, people made fun of you for that, right? Like, oh, is your forehead bleeding? Because I had the Sri Vaishnavite, Sri Charanam. And then so I'd get picked on, but it became much more clear to me that people had their own religious values that they were bringing to that table, even though we belong to a secular society. And it's like everyone came to that table with that, right? So then I went to Catholic high school, that my Hindu-ness was so put up in front because I had a Yagnopavitama, I played football, which meant a lot of time I had my shirt off and I was working out or whatever. And people would, I got it ripped off a few times by people that didn't care about it, right? So I remember these things that were part of my upbringing, but at the same time, it's very clearly put you in a position of trying to figure out where your place is in the world based upon, and this is particularly unique for my experience. I think a lot of Indian Americans or Hindu Americans go through this, even probably people in the UK. But I guess the question is, was there a sense that when you were growing up that you belonged to a particular community, or was it more just like kind of homogenized Hindu-ish kind of world that you came from?
No, I think that at least back in the 60s, early 70s, the notion of a Hindu identity wasn't that particular, certainly in Tamil Nadu. And particularly in Tamil Nadu, in Madras, it was Brahmin, non-Brahmin.
Right.
Primarily. So it was really to do with the inescapability of the tradition you were in.
Right.
You could be an atheist, didn't matter. You were subject to the same kind of education policies or reservation for openings and so forth. So to some extent, that the notion of a community identity was always there.
Right.
But there was also, deeply sort of for me, definitely a sense of a pluralistic sort of interflow,
right,
with people from, your neighbors were neighbors from different parts of the country. There were Hindus, there were Muslims, there were Sikhs, even in Chennai of that time, we had people, like that. It was not just, necessarily in Delhi or so on. So there was a sense that the homogenized identity made least sense.
Right.
What made sense was that the larger identity of being Indian was made up of so many of these coexisting identities. And I think it is a great tragedy of India that has really come under such severe pressure.
No, absolutely. And just on a point that you brought up earlier, my last guest was T.S. Rukmini, and she was talking about her experience with Matilal too. I've read his work. He was a giant. Honestly, like the fact that you got to study and learn from him, that's what a great opportunity in life that very few people had. So I mean, can you tell me about a little bit of your experiences with Matilal? Like a lot of it's sad to me when I talk to even Hindus today and I bring up Matilal, not many people know him, and they know Shankara, they know Madhva, they know these great scholars, but like the modern world, they know Vivekananda, right, or Radhakrishna, but you don't know Matilal. Matilal, I think, is changed the game for
again. It's
many
because
of us.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, and Jain Mohanty too, and this is part of that the vanishing of the role of the pandit in the modern global university context, in a sort of greater Hindu culture. There is no space left for that. It's like, I remember once, I think it was the very lecture you were talking, but one of the talks I gave on probably it was this one where I was talking about Hinduism and about Ramanuja and so forth, and then somebody underneath had just commented that really, no, if you want to understand the truth of Hinduism, and they here, and they gave some religious figure, some Swami, and I was like, you're missing the point of that. I'm not saying don't go listen to it, but this is a category error as to what you think you're doing. The pandit is not the guru. I might be an acharya, which is in between. That's another concept which is rarely understood. That the living of the intellectual life is the explication of a spiritual life.
Right.
That's what I try to argue in my first book, Knowledge and Liberation in Classical Indian Thought. It was basically saying that intellectual pursuit itself is not mechanistic.
Right.
It's a living, and it's exploring. You don't know where you will discover what it means to you. And Matilal wrestled with that because there was such a profound way in which he was Bengali, and he was always going to be Bengali. And his interactions, I mean, some of his closest friends, whether it was Mohanty or Tapan Rai Chowdhury, who was a historian in Oxford at the time, or Gayatri Spivak, whoever, or Ashish Nandi, they were all talking to each other as Bengali intellectuals and located in that culture. And yet, at the same time, of course, he was like, I go to Harvard in 1964 and they give me food. I have to eat what food? And I decided, all right, if I'm going to eat beef, I'm going to eat it. So he was very fascinated when I took him to high table in my college and, that I was rich. And he said, yeah, this is different in your generation. He said, you're all actually absolutely true. There was my father struggled at Cambridge and he stuck it out, but he lost a lot of weight being vegetarian. A lot of people, and he knew he was going back to India too. Whereas people who thought they were going to make their life in the West, who came in the 50s and the 60s. Even in my time, when I go to college, the guy serving would say, rabbit food? He'd say, do I look like a rabbit? I used to ask him, even then. So definitely, and that was in the 80s, right? So he was facing existential, literally, what am I going to eat? What's available? Who's going to understand? And he was, obviously he was reflective. So he was saying, what is it that makes me who I am? Nobody is going to stop seeing me as an Indian. Right. If they know more about, he spoke with a Bengali accent, he was vividly able to quote Sanskrit like that.
Right.
He had a particular cultural space that he occupied. And yet, of course, he was at All Souls and he was sitting with all these, white Western scholars. He was trying to engage deeply with analytic philosophy in a way which some critics have said, he was an apologist for Indian philosophy by saying, look, we can also do it. That's not what he was doing, but you could see how he was tussling with what it is to mediate between these ideas. So at times he, I think, felt pushed on all sides with trying to hold these worlds together as they were just forming in the mid to late 20th century. But a lot of the other times, he just lived the life he had chosen, which is, here is an argument in Prashasthapada, which is remarkable in addressing a problem that was identified by Locke 1,000 years later. So I'm going to go through and pick this way through, and whoever is interested, follow me through this. So in a way, kind of, when he was writing and when he was taking these classes, he was exemplifying it. And it was very interesting when he did classes with us, it was completely close Sanskrit textual reading. And a lot of the people who came to study these texts were people who were doing much more philological work, who absolutely did not participate in the idea of there being Indian philosophy for them. These were historical, these were text critical, this was history of ideas. So they were deeply sunk in that. And then there'd be me and a couple of others of us who were his students who would sort of say, is that what, so-and-so is, what Strawson was saying about Kant? And Matilal would just shift register. And he would say, yeah, you could do that. He knew that. And it became a different kind of class, much to the dismay of the philologists, who, mostly Western, for whom Indian philosophy did not exist as a category.
No, which is
able to do that.
No, which is fascinating, because I still think there's a lot of that happening today, right? I can still remember 20 years ago when I was in law school and also getting my master's, I took this class on democracy, and I remember writing my paper for that was really on elements of democratic ideas in ancient India, right? Whether it was going to the Shanti Padman and talking about Bhishma's view of kingship as being kind of coming from the power of the people, and the people have the right to revolt, and going back to the Vedic Ganan and Sabha, and I remember the professor at the time, he came back to my paper and said, these aren't democratic elements. These are all merely like kind of some sort of elements of ancient forms of kingship that aren't really based on principles of democracy. Democracy really came, and I just remember it was very, very interesting to me, because it's also like when you read philosophy on the whole, you get the history of philosophy, like a bunch of books back here. Not a single non-white philosopher or non-Greek or is found in this. And I think one person that's doing a really good job also on this is Dr. Eliza Freshy does it, and so does I don't know if you've listened to the history of philosophy without any gaps.
Yeah, sure. But I think one of the true inheritors of that Matilalian approach is actually Arindam Chakravarthi.
Yes.
Who's a slightly older generation from us.
No, absolutely. His work is
Arindam
great
is somebody for whom the sentence can begin with Levinas and end with Jayanta Bhatta.
Yeah.
With Strawson in the middle and a little discurses into Abhinavagupta. That is, in a way, to live that world and then to try and find how to write it. There is definitely an increasing number of people who are doing that. There's no doubt about it. And students want that.
And I did my paper, one of my master's papers on Heidegger and Advaita Vedanta, Dasein, connected that to the idea of Brahman. And it was very, I think these concepts are playing out a little more, but there's still this hesitancy in the academic departments to sequester out like Indian thought into either religious studies or area studies, and not like a universalist thought.
That's right, exactly.
But the work you're doing is, I think your project is pushing back.
Yeah, no, universalist is very interesting. My son calls this sleight of hand universalism. He's a philologist and classicist who's equally at home in Sanskrit as he is in Greek and Latin.
Right.
And so he works across multiple languages. And in a paper he wrote as an undergraduate, which is published in this now defunct site called Eidolon, called Decolonizing or Ancient World Studies. He calls this, sleight of hand universalism, where the idea is that it turns out, on the one hand, what the classics do, he was writing particularly about the classics, what the classics do, and therefore, Greek thought and so forth, is to speak universal truths. So it's about all humanity. But guess what? It turns out that only the Greeks can do it. Right? So the classical applies to the world, but the classical is only Greek and Roman.
Right.
So it's a sleight of hand universalism. That's the thing that characterizes so much, whether it's philology or philosophy or political thought, and so many of these areas, like with your professor in democracy. Democracy applies to everybody, but only we invented it.
Right.
So you want to hold it simultaneously as applying to all and get particular to some to have even thought about it on behalf of the rest of humanity. Perish the thought that others could have come up with other or competing or alternative thoughts.
Right.
So that is the problem that we really face. And that deeper hegemonic structure of thought isn't being necessarily shaken loose sufficiently by the way the pressures on the neoliberal university is making departments, at least, starting to shift, or publishers starting to have series with a wider range. They have to do it because people are asking for it. But where does that epistemic structure, where does that power still? It is still in that perspective.
Right.
That when we talk about unqualifiedly such a thing as philosophy, such a thing as the classics, of course we mean something which is unqualified, and that is a particular Western construct, whereas everything else is qualified in relation. Oh, yes, even Sanskrit is a classical language.
Right.
Kalidasa is whatever, the Shakespeare of India, whatever you want to say, but it is always hierarchized.
Sure.
And that is another problem we have. It's not, so it's either rejected. For example, all of classical Islam never recognized, except to say, oh, they got it, they got it from Aristotle. They preserved it for you.
They were a stopgap, right? That's what they're saying.
They were a stopgap. We took it back, and then we knew what to do with it.
Right.
All Avicenna and so on, So it's that you either marginalize or you hierarchize. But these are the only two ways in which you, ensure that there is no disruption to this particular kind of hegemonic way of looking at the Western materials as speaking for all humanity.
I mean, I would say to this, I feel like our particular problem today is the Western problem, but this is a problem I think all humanity possesses, right? Even in the sense within the Indian context, many people would say now, I think with a large movement with this homogenization and trying to push forth this Hindu civilizational idea, which some of that stuff is important and necessary, but it's the sense that nobody else has mystic knowledge, nobody else has this, and you're like, no, have you read any of these texts from Muslim traditions, Christian tradition, Chinese tradition? There's something deeper that everyone can have a partake in, that we're not uniquely us.
So that is, I think, the worst thing that modernity has done. It's what Ashish Nandi in a way calls the intimate enemy.
Yeah.
It's so close into you that you don't even recognize it. I mean, this has happened, of course, in China. It happens in the Arab world. It happens with Hindu nationalist reasoning, which is, where did that come from? It came from watching in action this kind of supremacism as the only way of locating yourself in the history of humanity. Where did you get that from? You got it from the Europeans. And now what happens? You think that the only way in which you can talk about the beauty and the range and the depth and the complexity of Indian thought is actually to decomplexify.
Right.
To homogenize, to not look at the knotty difficulties and problems that come with it, but to simply say we are simply better at it than everybody else.
Right. And I think that's a strong point. It's like the intellectual endeavor, and I think the way we must push forth is to, in some sense, see the qualified difference between peoples.
Yes, indeed. Exactly.
But also see it as this.
We would say that, wouldn't we? But
yeah, we would. No, but I this is what it's beautiful to me is when I started to read more and more. Like I got into Islamic philosophy in the past few years, and I found it, instead of the stupid caricature that is usually put forth by Islam, by people about Islam has no philosophy, he has none of this. There's some depth to this. And there's some great depth that we are missing that I think a lot of the modern world owes, especially a lot of modern intellectual thought through, like, Avicenna, Ibn Rushdi, all these great thinkers that brought new ideas to Western world in the sense of, what we now discuss. And we have through the Indian side, in the Western side, we have like, someone like Schopenhauer and, at some level Kant,
people who were.
So there was a lot of intellectual like amalgamation going on throughout history. And I think we can't simply just close our eyes to this and say, it's only Western thought, when Western thought isn't just Western thought
Is
anymore.
itself shot through with what isn't. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the construction of the other has been again a signal sort of mark of modernity,
right?
Because that idea that you erect borders to your land and your culture,
right,
and your history and your identity and your intellectual narrative, because only then are you going to be you,
right? That
was, of course, it was a powerful tool in the construction of European imperial empires, right? Of course, but everybody else is living with the consequences of that.
Sure, right. I mean, the only way you can subjugate other people is to show how different they are, and they're both physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever you want to do. And so that was the European project, right? At the end of the day.
Well, I mean, one of the things I teach my students in a course on religion and violence is this fascinating debate at the Spanish court at the time of their sort of conquest and subjugation of the Native American cultures. On the one hand, you want the missionary imperative is to destroy the Maya and the Aztec and the Toltec cultures and make them all Christian. But oops, on the other hand, if they are Christians, how can they be enslaved?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of the saddest things you see is how in the earlier part of the church's presence, the Catholic Church's presence in the Spanish Empire, the greatest resistance comes from the missionaries, because they say, if we are to convert, we cannot also not enslave. We can also not enslave because they are Christians, they are our brethren. 100 years later, the Catholic Church is one of the largest slave landowners in what is now Brazil and so forth.
Right.
And that whole argument has simply gone by the by.
Right.
So internally itself, you have this dialectic going. How do you other? Oops, what happens if you other? So in the end, there is a decisive settlement on the side of perpetual othering.
Right.
Because otherwise, the entire extractive enterprise that is, European imperialism would collapse.
Right.
And that intellectual reflex still plays. As soon as we start talking about immigrants at the border or coming up in boats, swarms and invaders and all of that, you're immediately reaching back to the same thing that has become a reflex of public culture in Western countries since the 16th century.
Right. It strikes me in so many ways that, aside from the political aspect, and this is the one political thing I'll say is, there's problems created by the West and across the world. yet they want to sequester the problems there and say there should be no blowback that comes, right? Like, the French and the Algerians, US and Mexico and South America. There has to, I mean, this is where I think again and again, like, we could take this larger idea of karma as cause and effect has a role. There has to be across the world some sort of cause and effect relationship. We can't simply just put up a dam and say that it only affects or stay there. The cause will be here. It doesn't function that way. But so going back to this, the other comment I will make is it is interesting to me that there's this new movement towards defining what a Hindu is in so many terms. I think that it's like practice, like not eating beef is now one of the new things that people are saying. Hindu must be, if you're going to be a Hindu, not eat beef, whatever. And they have like, there's this group that's trying to do this list of 10 big things. And I think a lot of problems that Hindus have is this idea of trying to identify themselves based upon, because we're not built by necessarily both praxis or, doxa. Right? We don't have a particular viewpoint on anything. We don't have a particular practice on anything.
The point is, who are the we? Because the thing I would say is, somebody's drawing up a list. Who the hell are you to tell me?
Right. No, that's right.
Who the hell are you to tell me? Each of us can draw the list. And it's we are not subjecting again enough the critical scrutiny of these kinds of hegemonizing developments from within the history of Hindu thought. Because, of course, the brave critics, to the extent there are brave critics in India, they rely on a completely sort of presentist, liberal, secular modernity, which is deeply suspicious of the past, right? So when people in India are talking about these things, when Hindus are talking about it, what are they confronted with? They are confronted by a choice between those who think that there isn't any depth and worth and complexity and intellectual and emotional resource in the tradition, or by people who say, we can give you that intellectual and emotional reassurance by drawing up a list.
Right.
So what is missing is, I'm always completely disorienting people, because they say, oh, you're doing Gita, let me tell you about, or you've been studying anything on Hinduism, and the next thing I hear is, some, foul sort of anti-Muslim rhetoric or something like that. Because, I'm working on Sanskrit, what else can I be?
Right.
You have that on this side. And then on the other side, we have, chums at particular kind of self-style secularists and so forth, who can't understand. So you're taking all the Shankara business seriously.
Right.
Right? How can you, or you're reading all these texts as if they matter today. So it's that voice in the middle. I mean, of course, there are people trying to work through this and say, look, the contemporary can be addressed by the resources of the tradition itself. And that voice is growing, but it's still always squeezed in the middle. I'm thinking of a book like, have you read Gurcharan Das's book?
Of course, Difficult Being Good.
Gurcharan is exactly the kind of person who's saying, look, these are contemporary problems. These are modern challenges about what it is to be good, but they're also ancient.
Right.
And as soon as you go back into the past, you can go into the Mahabharata, perhaps more profoundly than you can go into Homer.
Yeah.
Right? So why don't we do that? But that way of going into the past and coming into the present leaves open the political project of what a Hindu is today. Because there was never a political project of who a Hindu was in the past.
Well, a part of this is connected deeply to, I think, a lot of people's inability to think complexly about things, right? So when you hear from the liberal and I am a liberal person, and I even have leftist leanings in many ways. But when I hear from most liberal leftists, when I start bringing Mahabharata, their first response is, well, that's casteist, that's this, why would you go back to that? You can look at these other, and I'm like, but you don't understand what that text is trying to tell us about these things, or like when you talk to other, I've seen Western scholars even call the Mahabharata simply a family feud in which a bunch of other stories are built, and this difficulty.
Unlike, of course, the the Iliad, which was nothing at all to do with family feuds.
Right. And the difficulty comes is to have a conversation. You're always I would say for me, I'm always on the back foot because there's a lot you have to explain before you can even talk about like the text, right? The text, like when people talk about Mahabharata, I'm like, you don't need to take it literally. Whether Krishna exists, Arjuna exists, who cares? That's not the point of the text. The point isn't the literal historical value of individuals living in that world. There's something deeper having conversation about the human nature, the nature of existence, that like you're saying, is the same problem in the past as it is today, that will be in the future, that as human beings we'll just never get rid of. And the text is trying to grapple with it. It doesn't give you an answer. That's one of the few things I love about the text. It doesn't give you an answer.
Yeah, no, exactly. It is the open-endedness of materials which are irreducibly plural.
Yes.
That marks the Hindu tradition's contribution, and the Buddhist traditions, the classical, pre-modern Indian traditions, when it comes to this. And again, it's that weird kind of presentism about, the Mahabharata is sexist and race, casteist. Okay, so let's look around the world and find a text that doesn't do that. Right. That's not the issue. Now, you listen to Martha Nussbaum holding forth on gender, while being a scholar of Aristotle, than whom you can't find a more sexist and hierarchist thinker, or characteristically of all of Greece of that time. Oh, no. What you have to do is to interpret, because the text lives and it offers us, well, if Aristotle can do that, the Mahabharata can't.
Right.
So why is it that these, this tradition is locked away and must always be criticized in terms of its failure to, at that time, have spoken to our present concerns, correct, while simultaneously being told to only be kept as a historical, kind of existent, while the creative theoretical reinterpretation, making alive again of the Western texts, classical texts, continues apace. Nobody bats an eyelid. If you say, on the one hand, oh yes, all of Western history, philosophy is a footnote to Plato, on the one hand. On the other hand, Plato is a fascist. But you can hold the thought together. And we know this. And yet you read out of Plato truth and beauty and goodness and so forth. And so you can't do that with the complexities of, say, the Upanishads.
Right.
So it's the double standard again. It's the locking away of these materials.
Right.
The richness and the creativity that they continue to speak to us. And if they speak to us, they're seen as somehow, you could only be part of a political agenda, which is not helped, of course, by it being part of a political agenda.
Right. It's the part is all things are political on some level, right? Like the way we think about the world is engendered, it's political. And this goes back to, I think, your book that you talked about, The Body, right? In many ways, how all conversations in some level are embodied conversations, from a place of recognizing where, and this goes to your mind too, like, which is where the difference of the Descartes version of the mind versus the Hindu notion of the mind, which is very much, for Hindu Buddhists, is a sense it's embodied, it's connected to a physical nature of ourselves. And I think this is the point that you're driving in some senses. If there's a political element that is the part of our nature, it's going to come out whether or not we're man, woman, whatever race, gender, whatever it is.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that really marks how we live in this in Western modernity is that the multidimensionality of the person their uniqueness in terms of their God or their relationship to a set of contemplative practices, whatever those alternatives were, which are then manifested in the way they live in the world. Those are all not disregarded. What is regarded is the way we are bodily in this world. So I'll tell you a good example of this. Now, we find out something that a few historians have known, but now others have brought out. Many of the Roman emperors were black. They came from Northern Africa.
Sure.
There were Northern African legions in Britain. Shock, horror. Ancient Britons had a black population. People can't process this.
Right.
So either you have a right-wing response, which is nonsense, this is political correctness gone mad, etc., without actually addressing the fact we've got coins which show people. There are descriptions of how they were. Right. So they disregard all of that and say, how can this be? How can this be? Equally, you have well-meaning liberals who say, see, it's wonderful. There was a time when Roman society was not racist. No. The category of race was not salient.
Right.
You could have slaves, perhaps. That is a political structure. Anybody could be a slave. Anybody could be a senator. If they had the means to do so.
Sure.
It could be
based upon the rules, whatever rules they had in that society.
Whatever they have.
Yeah.
But now, why? It's because we are so habituated now to thinking that the bodiliness in the world, how we are present in the world, is who we are.
Right.
So, you see a Muslim woman with a hijab. That is her presence.
Right.
Right? Oh, you look very fair. You look very dark. Like, oh, but I thought she's African. Well, it might come as news to you, but there are black Muslims. You're not only getting South Asians and Arabs. What is it to construct a category of presence?
Right.
Why is that so? Why is it that people are responded to? Because now the bodiliness is always the way you're projected to the world. So when I went first, a friend of mine, a colleague, a sort of peer, thought he was being very funny because, he said, I told somebody in another college that we have somebody who's come to do Indian philosophy. And that man asked, is he wearing orange robes? And I replied, no, not at all, a tweed jacket. and he thought he was being really, really wickedly witty about it. And, he was kind of saying, it doesn't matter. I know, you might be doing weird things called Indian philosophy, but I put an arm around you because you're recognizably tweed jacketed, right? What has happened is my presence in the world has been constructed in terms of this outward bodiliness,
right,
which is not how people were seen. So forms that are seen now as the most obvious way of discriminating against people or counting them as part of your inner circle. These were not the ways in which the human being was bodily being before the disruptions of modernity.
Right.
And so we're not saying we should not be tackling. So a pronounced program of tackling, say, gender inequality is something we owe to modernity in a way that was never conceived of in the past. So yes, of course, we need to utilize those freedoms that have come with it. But we have to recognize that particular responses to the human condition don't need including everything else that comes with modernity. We need to ask, what are the alternative sources? Why are there some other ways of thinking that might not be as problematic? And the nature of the bodily being in the world is really one of them.
So on that point, I was thinking through this, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Is part of what we think about ourselves as bodily being in this world, along with the rights that come with that said body, is it seems to be more and more mediated by technology, right? Like the nature of women's rights really took off when we got birth control and contraceptives, which allowed women the freedom to be I wouldn't say non-gendered in any way, but like in less bound to the biological constrictures of evolution in human history. So that changed the way that we think about womanhood in this day and age. Do you think that this historically has been the case for, human beings, not just women, but different people throughout time? And is it something that you think about, even thought about writing in terms of future? What happens when we're able to not even be in the bodies we're in? We could change our genes. This sense of what it means to be human and bodied shifts.
Yeah, I presume it would. I mean, I think that technologies have always restructured, reconfigured who we are. And again, to some extent, problems have arisen in the modern period through too rigorous a definition of who a person is. So some of the fluidity with which people's identities were seen in the past perhaps allowed technologies of that time to be configured, around human beings more. But some of the greatest challenges to our bodily presence have come with contemporary technologies, the last 50 years, say, electronic technologies in particular, but also large-scale electrical technologies, have come exactly when we had lost a great deal of our sense of being more connected to the world. So, so for example, that it was the severing of millennia-old ties across the world to the environment that led to the explosion of industrialization.
Right.
That you no longer felt that you owed the land, or that the land had connections into you. All of those were dismissed as myths, as misperceptions of how we were connected to the world, that our connection to trees, for example, was just woozy stuff, that you just cut them up and that's the end of the story. So what happened was we severed a whole series of cultural shifts, severed us from the world precisely at the time when the technologies of exploiting that world grew exponentially, and perhaps grew precisely because we couldn't care anymore, or perhaps they were correlated, I don't know, right? So now when we face the next generation of electronic technologies, post-electronic technologies, things that shift what it is for us to be in the world, we are conceptually trapped.
Right.
Most. So we're kind of like, so people oscillate between saying, it doesn't matter at all, we could be completely robots. Well, that's because you have a very Cartesian view that who you are is a mind and the body. No, it isn't. We are whole. We are embedded. I mean, that was what my book was trying to say, that it's sort of where our boundaries stop, where our boundaries are, where we stop and where the world begins, shifts according to context.
Correct.
So in that case, we would perhaps be both less alarmist about some changes, but also more cautious about others.
But it's interesting because your book also makes me think about how that brain of the vat experiment maybe doesn't make as much sense as we
It doesn't make any sense. Exactly.
Right. So it is in some sense, the conversation even around like the nature of self at this point is very interesting to me, because I was thinking when my father passed away a year and a half ago, I didn't feel the same way that many other people felt. I felt like, the body, the person that is my father, the person that was my father, was a conglomerate of his physical nature. It's not the self that was my father. No, that Atma is not my father. The Atma is.
That's right.
But the bodied being that died, that was my father. So it's not like I'm going to go to the afterlife and see my father. There's that being, that prakriti nature of my father was embodied. So once that embodiedness is gone, that being is gone. I think this is where it's like, for me, it's to think about like human beings is we have to stop, in some sense, thinking about ourselves as being, like you said, like this self that's separate from this personhood. This personhood is the most important thing for us as we engage in the world together.
For our responsibilities, for our engagement.
Right. And,
but but that comes and goes.
Right. But this is where I feel like, so I was even thinking when I'm reading your book about the idea of intersectionality in some sense of, the modern concept of intersectionality of different roles and different positions one has. That's all embodied too, but it's also, it's not necessarily the same way that people talk about it as oppressor, oppressed kind of thing. It's complex relationships based upon particular nature that is in that moment, right? Like if I'm engaging with a woman in a romantic way, it's our man and woman nature that's connecting, not necessarily our friendship nature or whatever it is, right? This embodied, we're complex beings and we're different things at different times and sometimes multiple things at once.
That's right. Exactly.
So, but I mean, that's what I really enjoyed about that book. It was just really going through like your first section and then your Buddhagosha's practices was very interesting. And I was trying to get a sense of when you were reading that, was the practice a kind of a philosophy about the nature of the self, or was it a practice to get one to a place where they're able to?
Well, of course, Buddhagosha as a Buddhist doesn't think that there is a self in a
right.
metaphysical way, but what he is talking about is that sense of clinging, the sense of self that you have that makes you think I'm this and this and that. It's not some place to travel to.
Mm-hmm.
It's the path itself. It's the walking itself that is the path. The path and its goal are the same.
Right.
So it's walking the path that is the goal, because as you do that, for him, you get to nirvana.
But I mean, that's the general Buddhist idea of the process. It's like a process philosophy, right? So, as opposed
to it's not process philosophy, but no, I think process in Buddhism can go in all kinds of different ways. And Buddhagosha in particular is not particularly concerned at all about metaphysics. So that's another thing. My colleague in Amherst, Maria Heim, and I have argued, in a paper that, Buddhagosha is, like with much of the Theravada tradition, not concerned with a kind of building an ontology. I mean, he's committed to Buddhist truths, but for him, the Buddhist truths are phenomenological.
Right.
They are realized in the doing, in the being.
Right. So I wanted to get into a couple of the positions that you have in your lectures that we you did recently on your shift. Kind of, we talked earlier about going into Visisthadvaita Vedanta from Advaita. So originally, what kind of drew you to Advaita Vedanta? Was it just the intellectual milieu in which, when most people talk about Vedanta, even in the West, it's Vedanta just means Advaita. So is that what kind of got you there?
No, what got me there was that, the first kind of philosophical thinking, systematic thinking about self, knowledge, world that I encountered were Nyaya and Advaita. And and I was thinking that for me, I could kind of recognize, although I didn't recognize fully until I read Matilal, the systematic depth of Nyaya realism. But I just thought, in a way, I wasn't challenged by it.
Right.
What I was challenged by was the possibility of the radical revision that Advaita offers. I didn't put it in that way, but I was stunned by the surface claims. You're not what you are. The world isn't what it is. The explanation is like, and yet there is something there. How does that do it? So I was gripped by the potential of Advaita's sweeping program to reread the world, as I said, whether it's physics or whether it's just the ordinary world, whatever. So that's what got me into Advaita. It wasn't sort of thinking, Advaita in a very complex process becomes theicized and becomes much more consistent with a theological view of the world, and then gets associated very much with the Shaiva or Smartha tradition in South India, in Tamil South. I wasn't thinking I was doing any of these kind of sectarian moves and so forth. For me, Advaita offered an understudied area where there was not enough rigorous analytic presentation of Advaita. In fact, I think I was probably the first person to do that, because Advaita in the 20th century had been really about this kind of grand system building and so forth, whether it was Radhakrishnan or Hirayana or Raju, and all of these people were talking about it in this kind of sweeping terms. I was interested in how they were arguing their way with the Nyayikas, with the Mimamsakas, with the Madhyamikas to this position. So that was what interested me, that there was that analytic argument, but for a radically revisionary view of reality.
Right.
So, so in that sense, I wasn't particularly interested very much in the religious dimensions, how it was going to be, and so forth. And that's what, and I continued working on various aspects of Advaita for the next 20 years, bits and pieces coming here and there, although I wrote other things. But it's actually with Visisthadvaita, actually I came to it from a very different direction. I had a large grant on debates on self and no self with a couple of other scholars. And one of the referee, the named referee, that as we knew, the nominated referee was Julius Lipner, for a long time professor in Cambridge.
Face of Truth, beautiful book.
And Face of Truth, whose Face of Truth was the very first systematic book on Advaita, on Visisthadvaita I ever read, and I found it very, very funny because he was my examiner. And when he came and sat down, and I said, "You must excuse me for writing on this, because actually I'm born in Ramanuja's tradition." So he and the other external examiner, who was a Scottish philosopher of absolute idealism, they sat there and joked about, talked about, "Oh, really?" And sort of, it took 5 minutes of me being eased into, a delightful vibe, because they seemed sort of like more intrigued by this, somebody who should have been writing on Ramanuja, writing about Shankara. And I always told Julius, I dedicated that book, in fact, my 2014 book on the Gita Bhashyas of Ramanuja and Shankara, to Julius. So Julius was our nominated referee for that project, and he said, it's great. There are lots of things on, Mimamsa, on Advaita, on, various strands of Buddhism, but you aren't seeing anything about the nature of the self in theistic traditions. So it would be an important thing to do. I said, okay, I know what I can do. Finally, I can write a book which combines my interests in Advaita with my commitment to one day writing on Visisthadvaita. So it was actually that way that it emerged, still as a philosophical project. But by that time, I was kind of thinking, my interests were shifting perhaps away from the much more analytic focus on metaphysics and epistemology that had been largely my concerns in the previous 20 years. And I was beginning to write more on, trying to think about the sort of the phenomenal textures, the literary saliences of the tradition. So after that, I wrote a paper on Andal, for example. So I got more into thinking about the multidimensionality of traditions. I wrote recently, last year or something, a paper on, how Ramanuja wrote in the Vedanta Sangraha about this very interesting connection between sort of love and beauty on the one side and truth and reality on the other, and how for him cognitions and emotions were interwoven in this radical way that I hadn't even realized until you read how they are dichotomized in modern philosophy. And you kind of think, oh, for him, this is a different way of looking at the human being in the context of his larger understanding of the relationship between the human and God.
Right.
So these kind of things became more and more interesting. And in doing so, then I went into a whole new set of Western philosophical framings, which was largely the phenomenological tradition, especially around Heidegger and his notion of being, which and the developments in Western theology after Heidegger, which seemed to me to be mapping a lot of these debates about the nature of being, which in all their pre-Western, non-Western innocents, Ramanuja and Shankara seem to have come to think through themselves. So
Right.
it was in a way a gentle reproof, saying it's not quite as radically new as you think.
Right.
And it was, of course, remarkable how the response ranged from people who just weren't interested. They were not going to think that there could be alternative ideas about the God beyond being, which
Right.
wasn't rooted in Catholic traditions. And Catholics, people like Frank Clooney, for example, at Harvard, who are absolutely delighted that there is this real constructive, engaged way of thinking about Ramanuja with Western tradition. So again, I think the reception also often gets, don't want to know because it'll do my head in to
Right.
think that my familiar narrative of my location within my tradition is going to be challenged. Versus people who think, this is it, this is what you should be doing. From my perspective and my scholarship, I recognize what you're doing as something that is existentially important as well as intellectually contributing to a larger project.
Right. And we had Father Clooney on, I think, the first 5 or 10 episodes. So it was so I remember one of the first times when I was in Boston for law school, I went to a lecture in which both Frank Clooney and John Carmen were talking, and I was blown away by them. I really enjoyed their work. I wanted to, it was interesting because, like, even when you talk about the God as beyond being, as the ground of being, in some sense, that I think is even a modern Muslim scholar by the name Khalil Andani talks about, within the Neoplatonist Islamic view, it's somewhat similar. Is I think this comes across in even Ramanuja's own devotional work, even in the Gita or whatever, this God that is so beyond everything, out of pure love and compassion, decides to descend, to take avatar, right? It's something that, for me as a devotional Hindu myself and practitioner somewhat, I get overwhelmed when I do sometimes meditations where I just start weeping. I'm just not able to control, like, even sometimes when I think about the name of Rama or Krishna or whatever, it overwhelms me because there's something I can't explain that's so beyond, that's just like makes itself accessible in just that moment. That I think like you captured that in an intellectual way where I was not able to articulate that in any sense. And I really, really appreciate you. After I watched that video, I sent it to like 20, 30 different people saying, this is the feeling I get when I have, these moments.
I understand what you mean. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So the sense of, so when we talk about, what would you say is a big difference between the Advaita concept of Brahman or being versus the Visisthadvaita concept of being, in that sense?
Well, if you're going to translate Brahman as being,
as one, I guess you could do multiple versions of that.
For example, if you do that, Brahman is a ground of being. Broadly, for Shankara, as I read him in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Gita Bhashya, he has to explain the intransigent presence of Krishna.
Yeah.
As a personal, being who's there, who says, I, Vasudeva, I'm Ishvara, I'm God.
Yeah.
What's Shankara going to do? So Shankara's solution is to say that the Bhagavan, Ishvara, Krishna-Vasudeva, is the self-realized Atman, the Atman which holds in consciousness both its non-duality with the ground of all being, and also is able to be the one that transmits this teaching as a being amongst others.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how he tries to get out of it. But what that Brahman is that it pushes not only to all forms of being, but the ground of being itself. Because it is what I call a trans-metaphysics. It's not even metaphysics, not even about the structures of reality. Mm-hmm. How is it that what is possibly thought of can be thought of as real, as unreal, as in between, whatever, that comes within the compass of the individuated human consciousness? Where is that from? How is that even to become explicable? How are we even able to articulate the question of who am I and what is all this?
Right.
That ground that cannot but be there for everything else to be possible, but in comparison with which everything else is not. Being itself is not in the face of Brahman. But Brahman cannot be said to be that, because that would then bring it within its compass. So it's an explanatory principle and therefore cannot be explained. So that's Brahman. That's what it is to mean. It's that from which everything grows, including the world and its contested status, including God, including the individuated mind, consciousness, right? When that consciousness de-individuates, then there is no asking of who am I and what is this?
Right.
Right? That is why all of this asking is kind of provisional, is penultimate, because the very asking is a sign that you have not reached.
Interesting.
Right? From which all these questions arise. When that is there, when that de-individuation of consciousness happens, we can only say, as Vachaspati Mishra, his commentator, of the Brahma Sutra Bhashya says, the cognition on the edge of destruction recognizes that that's the end of explanation. Right? So that's the destruction of the cognition of the edge of destruction. So Brahman, therefore, is simply the name by which what cannot be named, neti, not this, can be done. It's only a performance of seeking knowledge that we can do. And Brahman is the name that is given to how the seeking of knowledge can be undertaken. That's why even in the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, that's how he interprets now, therefore, Atato Brahma Jignasa, now therefore the knowing of Brahman. So it's the action. So that's the Brahman. Ramanuja flips it around. For him, all of that talk about the metaphysics of being that is there in the Vedanta, going back to the Upanishads, earliest Upanishads, all of that is what has got to be explained away in terms of Krishna-Vasudeva of the Gita, the Sriman Narayana. So for him, the challenge is the other way around. Here we have a God who's personally present, who becomes available. And yet there is this elaborate metaphysics of Brahman. What's going on? So for him, then Brahman, because he has this famous categories of three categories of Brahman, he detects in the Gita. In some ways, he's although each of them makes the Gita speak for what they wanted to say, he does something. He says, look, Brahman is used in the context of the world. It's used in the context of the jiva, of the self, the individual being. And Brahman is used by Krishna of himself. So there are three categories of being. So in this pluralist metaphysics, the individual, the world, and the being itself. So these are two categories of being subsumed under being. So Brahman is being, right? So, and God is that, because there is a relationship. Only by this can you explain the relationship between the self and God.
Right.
Right? So this being is part of that being, even if they are in a way different.
Right.
So the Jnana Marga, the path of intellection, the path of de-individuation, which the Vedanta clearly teaches, must explain how the self is related to Brahman, who is God. And the way you do it is to say, once you realize that the being here is not different from the being, which is what the Vedanta clearly says,
right,
then there is this non-duality. And yet, Krishna, Sriman Narayana, is not only being.
Right.
Not only. So Brahman is contained in me. So for Shankara, Krishna is an expression of and therefore contained in Brahman.
Right.
For Ramanuja, Brahman is contained in Krishna. Therefore, Krishna is other than being, more than being.
Right.
So that is what is Brahman, even Parabrahman, who's all of being. Krishna is greater than that. So that's a God who's beyond Brahman, beyond being. That is utterly different from us.
Right.
That is the big qualification to non-duality. So we are non-dual as Atman to Brahman, but we are definitely not the same as Srimanarayan.
Yeah.
Krishna.
He's something beyond, a category well beyond that.
But yet is understood, what is this? Brahman is all that is, all the explanation is all being done.
Yeah.
And we've reached ground level. That's it. We can't go beyond Brahman. Out of sheer grace, out of sheer love, Krishna becomes available to be described from head to toe in Srirangam as Ranganatha, for example.
Right.
Successors of Ramanuja would do, or what the Arvas sang. The one that Andal was in love with.
Right.
How is that? It is a return of God. Once the intellect has exhausted itself in its non-duality, the grace of God qualifies it.
Wow. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, both these ideas are fascinating to me because even when you're talking about the previous, you mentioned how you started appreciating the hyper realism, or quote unquote, like the realism of Nyaya. In some ways, I think Visisthadvaita maintains that level of realism.
It is pluralist realist.
Yeah, because of Prabhakara Mishra, right? It takes that same.
That's right, as Elisa's point, Elisa.
Yeah. So so I think that's really interesting to me. Like, if you want to take it in the theological context, then what is evil then? What is evil within the Visishtadvaita tradition? What is evil or suffering within the Advaita tradition?
I think for Advaita, I mean, none of the Advaitins, classical Advaitins, are bothered at all to that issue. Because there isn't the need of a theodicy when God isn't ultimate.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
So an Advaitin can basically adopt any workable moral theory because it's all penultimate. That's not what it is about.
Sure.
If it's what you want to be about, you can be a Rawlsian Advaitin. No problem. You can be a communitarian Advaitin. It doesn't matter because it's whatever, you can be a dharmic communitarian. It's all right.
Right.
Basically, what you need is, because that's all in the world. All the relations, all the responsibilities, all the actions are all penultimate.
Right.
And Advaita is like, that's not what I'm talking about. But when you're talking about that, you can make any of that. You've got your responsibility to do that in your individuated state. Correct. But I'm talking to you about something far greater, which is how to become de-individuated. So that's why, modern attempts to make Advaita have its own homegrown, moral system and so forth is beside the point. To say, we must do away with the caste system because if all are equal, then we are. Actually, no, Shankara is not at all bothered with.
No.
Right? So no Advaitin, as I said. So you could have all kinds of systems. It's obviously more difficult for Visishtadvaita. Right? Because once you have a God, then you do have to have a theodicy.
Sure.
So it's still not salient to Ramanuja. It's still much more to do with sort of he's still willing to leave it as the blemishes of human life and the way we work through it karmically, as well as through our margas, our paths, rather than a question of God itself, because God, ultimately God is so far beyond our explanatory systems that to some extent for Ramanuja, it's not such an important thing because that's all part of the world. I mean, you see that, for example, in the Tamil culture, in Kamban's Ramayana, where, who is in some ways a Vaishnava, who's not technically a Sri Vaishnava. For him, the mystery, the tremendous mystery of God is that not only good, but evil, not only happiness, but sorrow. It's all contained in the divine. That's what it is for the divine to be divine.
Right.
Our responsibility is to act in a particular way. It's only when you get to something like the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, especially with modern thinkers, so deeply influenced by Western philosophy of religion. Western theologians don't think so. Western philosophers of religion who want to give systematic defense of Christianity. How can this be possible? Then they say, oh, it must be because it's soul building. It must be because it's this, that, and the other. These are the classic sort of things that come. And I would suggest that actually those concerns are very typical of a post-modernist Christian response to these questions, which weren't actually there for the tradition, not because they overlooked it, not because they thought we'd better dodge this question, not because they were lax in their thinking, but because they had a framework within which these things were not salient as problems to be theorized. They were rather, principles to live through.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because I there was a book I read a while back, Problem Evil by A.L. Herman, which he discusses various theories of evil going from Anselm to, Aquinas and then goes into Indian theories too, interesting enough, Indian philosophy. But one of the questions that comes up from that is, within even the Ramanuja system, there's a push, even Advaita, there's a push towards ethical behavior, following the text for knowledge, or Brahma Jnana, especially in Advaita, because you have to only through learning the Mahavakyas you can get into knowledge of Brahman. But what's the purpose of ethical behavior if it's not to address the evil in the world anyway, right? Is there a purpose to that? Is why would I behave ethically if all I need to do at the end of the day is worship God or gain the knowledge of Brahman? Is there not imperative to do better?
Well, yes, but not for yourself.
Okay.
Ethical conduct is required for the stability of society, and therefore, for the compassion for the suffering of others. Those are the kind of responses. So to say that the problem of evil is a particular individual enterprise, again, is a very early modern Christian reworking. Pre-modern Christians did not necessarily think of it in this way either. It is a kind of scienticization of Christianity that leads to atheism, and Christian, post-Christian atheism also leads to sort of saying this is about striving for yourself.
Right.
Whereas suffering is about compassion. Evil is about trying to right the wrongs in this world, regardless of the ultimate metaphysical status. To make evil a problem, a metaphysical problem, is something that develops relatively late in, even in Christian thought. And then because it becomes so important in modernity, it then sort of becomes the tail that wags the dog, and everybody's then going back to Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and trying to retrofit all these things. Which instead of which we must be asking, why did we come to ask that question in the first place? How are we framing it? And so forth.
Interesting. Another question I have is to you is, what are your thoughts on free will and sorry,
I've got to go in a bit. So
just a couple more questions and then we'll close out. So what are your thoughts on free will and karma, and is there a sense that you have what the texts say?
No, I have nothing new to say on this. I don't particularly, again, articulation of the notion of free will is not something that I see as, again, it's not a universal question of interest to me. It's again, you need to, it's not a compelling question for me.
Sure.
I don't see that as necessary to even think that that's the human problem we should be dealing with. Because the way you set it up is going to presuppose certain kinds of answers that you're already going for. Whereas, if you're thinking about accounting for the human being in this world, free will as the way to articulate whether we do things or not doesn't actually determine anything about what we are going to do, how we are going to go about it, what the purpose of our behavior is.
Right.
So it's for me an otiose question.
Yeah.
It is only because it has obsessed a certain class of thinkers, in the last 300 years in the West, has somehow taken on the status of a question that we must all address. I don't even see why you should do that.
No, I agree with you. So this is actually one of the points I push back is generally on free will is because people have asked me to ask you this, and I was of the opinion that free will doesn't matter because functionally we function as if there is one. Whether it metaphysically exists or not, it means nothing to us, right?
Yes, the point is it a moral question?
Yeah.
In which case it makes no difference.
Right.
Or is it a metaphysical question? But why are you asking that? There are so many other questions to ask about the nature of the self, about the nature of consciousness. It's, for example, the connection between the self and reality.
Yeah.
Western thought doesn't even deal with it.
No.
Whereas Vedanta is like, what else is more important? Going back to the Upanishads, what's the connection between me asking the questions and all the things that I'm asking the question about?
Right.
Right? That question is completely dominant since the Upanishads, and yet it's never asked in the West. So if we went around telling people, okay, tell me about the relationship between individual consciousness and absolute reality.
Right.
No, I wouldn't even do that. Well, I wouldn't do anything about free will.
Right.
It's where you're starting with, where is your metaphysical starting point? What are you conceiving of as the salient issues about truth and reality?
Right. And I think that's where two of your papers, the one on dreams, was touching upon, and also the Sriharsha point. Your Sriharsha paper, I think, was also touching about this conversation about how we get to the sense of understanding whether it's real or not real in terms of just having a dialogue, which I thought was really interesting. So just, I know you have to go. What are you working on now, if you want to tell our audience?
I'm working on a book on emotions.
Okay.
And it's what emotions are and how they arise is something to talk about. Is often taken for granted again as arising from Western thought.
Mm-hmm.
For Aristotle, the concept of pate, which translated as emotion, comes in his book on rhetoric. So it is about how do you manipulate people and so forth. Emotions are also reconfigured in the modern Western tradition, especially from Descartes on, in terms of cognition and reasoning and the relationship between that and how we feel things. So reason and passion and whether they're connected and so forth. So all the subsequent program of thinking about emotions happens in these areas, in terms of cognitive psychology, in terms of or in terms of rhetoric, in terms of the structuring of human reasoning and so forth. In India, actually, it happens in a completely different place, which is in aesthetics.
Yeah.
Which is Rasa. So there, the idea becomes basically that play and poetry, literature, is ultimately meant in some way or the other to bring about an aesthetic experience, the essence called rasa. That might be in the text, and these things change over time. It might be in the actors, it might be in the spectator or the audience, and so forth. I'm not so interested in that side, on the Indian aesthetic side. There's some very good work on rasa theories that have come up over time, and the poetics of it, alankara. How do you use language to bring about this? I'm asking a different question, which is, you couldn't be getting to even talk about how plays and poetry and so on and art can evoke and the experience of certain aesthetic states unless human beings were already particular kinds of beings, i.e., beings of emotion. It's because we experience grief, we are able to understand what an aesthetic, the tragic aesthetic, would be. Because we want to have an explanation. Nobody wants to lose their beloved ones.
Yeah.
And yet we have a particular aesthetic experience of seeing or reading about somebody losing their loved ones, which is very different from if you find it funny that somebody for slips on a banana skin in real life, you'll find it funny on stage.
Right.
So there is no discontinuity between the two. And then there is in between.
Right.
You, in the case of the erotic aesthetic, where it's clear that in order to appreciate the relationship, the love between two people, you have to know something about love.
Right.
And yet you're dangerously drawn into thinking about the actor. Right? So when people fall in love with, they think, with film stars.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a kind of an in-between where you need simultaneously to have a connection, which is closer than the one between grief and the tragic, but it's not as smooth and continuous as with a comic.
Yeah, yeah.
Where what you laugh for in the world and what you laugh on stage is the same. So different emotions have, we are structured by emotion in such a way that we are capable of having the aesthetic appreciation of it. That means that in talking about aesthetics, the aestheticians of classical India are already telling us something about what I call a philosophical anthropology of emotion. They already have a way of thinking about how human beings are emotional beings, because only through that are we going to say what is a great work of poetry or good work of art. Now, the great advantage with this is you have a ready-made case for why art and literature matter. Whereas when I see classical works, when people working on classical Greek and Roman emotions, on the one hand, they have the theory, and then they have the great plays and poetry. You have to use this theory to do this, but you don't have a justification why you're doing it. Right. Whereas the Indian material is always saying it's there. And the poets and the dramatists knew this, even when they disregarded the theoretical framework.
Right. I mean, Abhinav talks about it in the Abhinav Bharati.
So the book's theoretical basis is a reading of crucial structure bits of the Abhinav Bharati, some of which have not been translated before and so forth. I worked with parts of it with Vakaracharya, who's a current scholarly professor at All Souls, and some of the other materials. Great translation work has been done by Sheldon Pollock in the Rasa Reader, even when I disagree with quite how he reads it. A lot of the scholarship is emerging, but a lot more to be done on Abhinava. But I'm using Abhinava to develop this way of thinking about why aesthetics might be a lens through which we understand emotions.
Very interesting.
Which is a very different starting place than what are the disciplinary framings by which we look at emotions in Western thought.
Wow. Having
done that, I'm then going to turn rather arbitrarily to 4 things that might be seen as, emotional dispositions. And I'm going to be reading, and I'm reading literature, kavya, play, closely, especially with a kind of gendered thought in mind, to just give a demonstration of what it is to read. So not using Abhinava's theory, but rather simply to say, if you are sensitized by Rasa and Bhava theories, we might read, Shakuntala. We might read the Uttara Ramacharita. We might read the Mahabharata or passages in it differently. And so I'm writing a chapter on anger, on love, on grief, and on peacefulness.
Oh, that sounds great. I mean, like once that's done, please, I'll let me know. I'll have you back on to discuss.
Once my university and the world allow me to spend less time on my administration, I will get this book done.
So I feel like, again, this is like a thread connected to your last book on the bodily nature. So I imagine that's going to play some role in how we think about even the aesthetics of emotions, so that's going to be very interesting. I'm really excited about that. Again, I've had you on for almost 2 hours now. So Dr. Ram-Prasad, do you have any last thoughts or comments you want to tell our audience?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. If anybody at all is patient enough to hear our conversation through across the 2 hours, they must be either extremely interested or extremely bored. So I hope it's the former.
I hope so too. So once again, thank you for your time. So everyone in our audience, I'll put show notes and Dr. Ram-Prasad's where you can get his books and his articles and see his lectures on below. So once again, thank you
for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ram-Prasad. I really appreciate it.
यमुना तीरे गायती वनमाली गायती वनमाली मधुरम गायती वनमाली